Hello and welcome to the July 2021 podcast from Monde, diplomatique. My name's George Miller, and my guest this month is Kristen Ghodsee, who's a professor of Russian and East European Studies and a member of the graduate group of anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. Kristen has spent much of her career thinking about Eastern European women, feminism, and female empowerment. In this month's edition of Le Monde diplomatique, she draws on that experience in a piece entitled When the Women's Movement Went Global. Kristen argues that the conventional narrative of the 20th century women's movement is only half the story. The West was not always the front runner. The USSR put Valentina Tereshkova into space in 1963. The US didn't open its space program to women for more than another decade. But type First Women in Space into Google, and the first hit is Sally Ride, NASA astronaut, part of the Challenger mission, in 1983. Back on terra firma, US leaders in the Cold War worried that communism might begin to appeal to American housewives if they saw their Eastern European peers had opportunities they lacked. Today, we tend to picture Soviet women in bread queues, and tend to forget the women engineers, doctors and scientists that the Soviet bloc encouraged. From the 1970s, women's leaders from Eastern Europe made common cause with their counterparts in the global South, seeking to broaden the debate about rights to include deep systemic inequalities. But before we discuss the overlooked and forgotten red grandmothers of feminism, I began by asking Kristen to summarise the conventional narrative of the women's movement that she set out to challenge.
This is, a kind of standard narrative that gets taught, for instance, in gender studies classes today. And, there's kind of this sort of progenitors moment with people like John Stuart Mill and Mary Wollstonecraft in France, Olympe de Gouges. And that eventually kind of feeds into the suffragette or the suffragist movement, which is called these days the first wave of feminism. So you have people like Emmeline Pankhurst, obviously, in the United States. You have Susan B. Anthony and Lucretia Mott. And then, women get the right to vote. Somehow they just go quiet. They go away. They disappear into their homes for a while. We don't hear from them. And then in 1963, Betty Friedan publishes The Feminine Mystique, which is the launching point for the quote-unquote second wave of feminism. You get people writing like Germaine Greer. You have Gloria Steinem, who founds Ms. Magazine in the United States. And for a while, women of the second wave, fight for equality in the workplace and equality in access to education. And then eventually you get something that's sometimes referred to as the third wave, what we call post-feminism, sort of a more pop girl power kind of feminism that we see today. It's sort of Sheryl Sandberg lean in type thing and hashtag girl boss. And it's a very pat Western trajectory that largely leaves out for a long time women of color, women from the global South, and of course my particular interest is women from the state socialist East.
And that Western narrative has been much written about, much reflected on, has been archived. For anyone who's curious about it, there's a rich repository of material to work on, which I guess could amplify this sense that really is the main event.
Absolutely. And, it also gets sort of reified in other ways. So when the United States decided, for instance, to put the first face of a woman on a piece of money, on a coin, it was the dollar coin, they chose Susan B. Anthony. When Time magazine decides to make a list of the 100 most important people of the 20th century, Emmeline Pankhurst makes that list. Very few other women do. But it's interesting that it is this sort of Western liberal feminism. And, everywhere you go, whether it's to sort of archival women's archives, women's history journals, kind of popular women's programming. There are a few exceptions, and as I would say lately, there have been some more exceptions. It generally tends to be this very Western focus on Western white women, largely middle-class women and above, privileged women, who were fighting for things like married women's property, who were fighting for access to professions that had been closed to them, who were fighting really for certain kinds of privileges within the capitalist economic system that they felt were unfairly being held right from them because of their sex, because of their gender. And what they didn't question, what they really had no interest in questioning, was the economic system that kind of produced and perpetuated that inequality in the first place. And so one of the big problems of the waves narrative is that some scholars call it a missing wave. And that's in the 30s and in the 40s. There were many women, also from the West, by the way, who fought in the Spanish Civil War and who fought as partisans against the Axis countries in Eastern Europe in particular. There were many women who were committed socialists and committed communists who, as part of their ideals for building a better world after fascism was defeated, was a world which included gender equality. And many of these women go on to become quite prominent in the United Nations, especially during the UN Decade for Women, which we'll talk about in a bit. And that is the beginning of the erasure of this other strand of feminism that I write about in the article for Le Monde diplomatique.
Going back in your own research, what was your own personal way in to beginning to sort of excavate this little known and untold history of the women's struggle in Eastern Europe and beyond in the global South?
I think initially there were lots of things that interested me, particularly the writings of people like Clara Zetkin, who was the head of sort of the women's part of the German Social Democratic Party in the late 19th century, early 20th century, as well as the work of somebody like Alexandra Kollontai, who was the first Soviet Commissar of Social Welfare and a very prominent feminist theorist herself. But the real impetus for my personal research, I think, came from reading some reports that were being produced in the 50s and early 60s in the United States, where American government officials were extremely nervous about the fact that the Soviets were educating so many women in science and engineering. This was after the 1957 launch of Sputnik, the satellite, right? And then in 1963, Valentina Tereshkova is the first woman in space. And all of these stereotypes that Western men had, that women couldn't be good engineers or couldn't be good scientists or couldn't be astronauts, right? Because they were just somehow either mentally or physically incapable of these things. The Soviets were presenting them daily with evidence to the contrary. And there was a real nervousness, I think, among clearly we see this with the Kennedy administration when he signs the first there's an executive order 10980, I believe, which establishes the first presidential commission on the status of women here in the United States. It's done for national security purposes. And to me, that was a really kind of curious find, that suddenly you could ignore women's rights. You could ignore, we've given them the vote. Okay, they should be happy. They should stop asking for other things. But suddenly you're starting to look at women and you're thinking, okay, maybe our long-term national viability as a competitor in this Cold War, as a competitor in this superpower rivalry over which economic system is better, hinges on whether or not we extend some more rights to women in our society. And I found that fascinating.
And you've done a lot of interviewing of people who, in the latter part of the 20th century, played a major part in fighting for women's rights and in different contexts, from, the more affluent white women that you've talked about in America and Western Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, I was really fortunate. One of the women that I interviewed, a woman called Elena Lagodinova, who's mentioned in the article, I spent a lot of time with her over 7 years doing oral history interviews and working with her personal archives. She was not only the president of the Bulgarian Women's Association for 22 years and a very important figure at the United Nations. She's elected the General Rapporteur of the Third World Conference on Women in Nairobi in 1985. But she was also the youngest female partisan fighting in Bulgaria during the Second World War. She was 14. So she did kind of bring in that sort of interesting point of view of what is often called the missing wave of feminism. These young women who were quite profoundly radicalized by militant struggle against fascism in the 30s and 40s. And they take that really militant struggle and they bring that into the women's movement in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I think that my own research, I have interviewed women in Eastern Europe. I've done a lot of archival work. But I also, as part of the project, which is a book, Second World, Second Sex, that the article kind of emerges out of, I traveled to Zambia. And I was very interested to speak to Zambian women who fought against the British for their national independence in the early 60s, and how their struggle against colonialism actually also radicalizes them to become feminists. And so I did oral histories with women in Zambia, and I also worked in the Zambian archives of the United National Independence Party. And then so I was really fascinated through these oral history interviews and through this archival research, specifically starting with women in Zambia and Bulgaria. And then I also did research in the United States to kind of try to get the opposing point of view. But what I uncovered was this massive international network of South-South and what we would think of as East-South connections between socialist and more broadly leftist women who were really fighting for women's rights from a very different perspective than the narrative that we get in the West today.
So it's a much richer, much more complex story than simply a Western US view of the women's movement versus a communist Eastern Bloc view. The connections, the sympathies, the joint efforts are much richer than that, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. And the thing about it is that if you actually take the time to go back and read, this is why I did archival research and some oral history interviewing in the United States. If you talk to people who were there during the UN Decade for Women between 1975 and 1985, or people who were at the Commission on the Status of Women at the United Nations, they were very concerned about these South-South and East-South connections. So if you look at the archival record in my country, for instance, the United States Agency for International Development in many ways creates a Women in Development desk as a way of pushing back and resisting what they see as the increasing alliance between East and South women and East-South countries over issues like women's rights. And so, I think one of the kind of greatest ironies, of course, of the 20th century is that the United States really held itself up as a beacon of democracy, a beacon of freedom and liberty, while at the same time really violating the civil rights of many populations in its own country. And it turned out that the Soviets and the Eastern Bloc more generally often pointed this out at the world forums like the United Nations. And that slowly started to profoundly bother the United States. I mean, also the anti-colonial narrative was also aimed at places like France and in the United Kingdom. And so there was a way in which I think that the reason part of this history is lost is because it represents a really anti-Western, a kind of anti-capitalist view of women's rights that the West was forced in some ways to respond to. And when they responded to it, they wanted to make it seem as if it had all been their idea to begin with, because of course they're the champions of liberty and freedom and democracy and all those wonderful things that we hold dear. And so to accept that they were reacting to this challenge from the socialist East and the socialist South, is a little unpalatable, I think, for the women's historians of the West.
So if you go back to sort of immediately post-revolutionary Russia, how quickly do you see a different conception of women's role in society begin to emerge? I mean, is it something that's present pretty early on?
It's like weeks. I mean, the thing is that Okay, so remember in Russia, you have the February Revolution, where there's the provisional government. And then in October, you have the Bolshevik Revolution. And Kollontai, Alexandra Kollontai, is a very prominent Bolshevik at this point. She's originally a Menshevik. She's a social democrat, but she comes to her Bolshevism because of her opposition to the First World War. And as soon as the Bolsheviks take power, I mean, within days, she's installed as the first commissar of social welfare. And, you know, if you know your revolutionary history, almost overnight, there are these sweeping administrative decrees that come into force in the early, post revolutionary period. And the first thing that they do is they abolish church marriage and allow women to get divorced. It's one of the first decrees. It's a very popular thing at the time. And then by 1918, there's a complete revision of the family code, which is phenomenally transformative for Soviet women. It's so far-reaching that it gets rolled back in 26, and then it finally gets rolled back completely, really, by Stalin in 36. But it's important to understand that Russian women got the right to vote in the summer of 1917 before women in the West, right, in most Western countries. And it's partially because they demanded it. It was granted under the provisional government. And the first elections that happened, the first only real elections that happened in the Soviet Union, women participated in a massive way. And on top of, the legal framework that was changed in order to grant women full civil rights in the Soviet Union. I mean, this is very early on. In the period of 1918, 1919, 1920, 21, 22, after the creation of this thing called the women's section, the Zhinotel, they also radically expanded kindergartens and nurseries for young babies. They expanded public cafeterias and canteens. They expanded public laundries to try to socialize women's domestic work so that women would have more opportunities to go and work outside of the home in order to become economically independent from men. So the irony, I think, of the Soviet Union is that the early period, really through the 20s, is incredibly radical. But then, unfortunately, it mostly gets reversed. And it's only after the death of Stalin in the mid-50s that you begin to see the re-emergence of a really strong women's movement, not only in the Soviet Union, but really in Eastern Europe, these newer socialist countries that are rebuilding after the Second World War.
Because, I mean, to someone like me who's not a specialist at all in Soviet history, I might have, thought of things like access to divorce and access to abortion and education and access to professions that were less accessible in the West as positives. But then I might have thought about, propaganda posters with injunctions to produce lots of children. And I think you say in your article that women had access to the labour market, but they also had the expectation of being mothers. And also, think about pictures of the Politburo, and it's alarmingly male, even as, I know in the West that progress was very slow, but so it's clearly a mixed picture, but you at least want to bring that picture back into the bigger narrative.
Right, absolutely. And I think it's very important to say that there's a lot of heterogeneity across this former socialist bloc as well, right? So abortion, the Soviet Union is the first country in the world to make abortion on demand legal in 1920. That decision is then reversed in 1936, right? There is this huge push for pronatalism, meaning that women should be mothers. They have a social duty and an obligation to reproduce. Now, part of this is because so many Russian men died during the First World War and the Civil War, and then there was a famine. So if you wanted to actually kind of create an economy, the Soviets weren't the only ones who were pronatal. But in most Eastern European countries after 1945, abortion remains legal, with a very notable exception, as I said, of the Soviet Union between 36 and 55, in Albania, and then in Romania after 1966, you have one of the most brutally pro-natalist countries in the world. But in all the other countries, with some restrictions here and there, more or less depending on where you are, they were pronatalist, but they guaranteed women's full reproductive freedoms. And I think that is an interesting tension that a lot of people are not aware of. And yes, I think the big problem is the double burden. Men were workers but they weren't necessarily expected to be fathers, whereas women were always seen as both workers and mothers. And that was something that these countries tried to challenge. I spoke at length with somebody like Elena Legadinova about this challenge. But it ended up being much more difficult to get men to help out in the home than it was to just socialize the things that men would be helping out with, right? So childcare and domestic work, largely speaking. When I went to Zambia, I would say that the sort of Zambian gender landscape was even more traditional. You know, patriarchy was deeply entrenched in some ways within the Zambian culture that I experienced when I was there, and talking about these women who really saw themselves as what they called it African humanism. Sometimes they would use the term socialism, but they preferred the term African humanism. And as African humanists, they really did see women as having a particular role in society, and they wanted women to be women. They just didn't want their femininity or their womanhood to hamper their progress in any way. And so that's where you see things like the extension of childcare and the guaranteeing of job-protected paid maternity leaves as being really important innovations from the socialist world that then kind of make their way into the West. But it was not perfect by no means. And I think that, we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, as they say. And so it's really important to look at what they did right. I think that after the end of the Cold War, unfortunately, we kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater. There were some really good things that occurred, particularly along the lines of women's rights, and we should learn from them and not just sort of paint them with a big black brush of Stalinism and purges and gulags, which is what we generally tend to do when we think about the state socialist East of the 20th century.
Kristen, you've already mentioned the UN's International Year of Women, which actually then inaugurated a decade for women. I wonder if you can say a little bit about what the impetus behind that was and how important you see it in the wider history that you're interested in.
Yeah, so this is really key because without the Eastern Bloc countries, we would probably not have had an International Year of Women, right? In 1972, this year is proposed by a Romanian delegate at the Commission for the Status of Women at the United Nations. And it's done at the impetus of this large umbrella organization, which I write about in the article called the Women's International Democratic Federation, which was initially, by the way, based in Paris. And it's only after its president opposes the war in Indochina that they get expelled and they have to go to East Berlin. This organization is kind of a large international umbrella organization for women who are really interested in issues of peace and development, because many of them come out of the sort of anti-fascist, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist background of the Second World War. When they coalesce into this organization, it's this organization that really is the mover and shaker on the international field in terms of women's rights. And ever since 1945, when they're founded, they have these sort of every 5-year conferences where they bring women together from all over the world to talk about women's issues and to talk about issues of peace and equality. 1975 was the 30th anniversary of the Women's International Democratic Federation. And so they proposed this International Women's Year at the UN in order to kind of commemorate their own 30th year anniversary. And they planned a huge congress in Berlin in October 1975. And as it happened, some American women got wind of this and were quite upset that this big international conference on women was going to be held in a communist country to which many American women didn't feel that they could go. And so they put pressure on the U.S. State Department to give money to the UN to create an official UN Congress that would occur in a non-state socialist country. And that's how you have the first World Conference on Women, which is held in the summer of 1975 in Mexico City. And this is a huge deal. In so many ways, it kind of kicks off what we think of as the global women's movement. All these countries convene, these are UN member states, they send delegations to Mexico City to discuss the status of women. And there are some debates about what it means to have a women's conference, and there are huge Cold War tensions, as I'm sure you can imagine, given that it's 1975. And, there's just been a coup against Salvador Allende in Chile. The United States has just withdrawn from Vietnam after losing. And there's a lot of anti-American sentiment at this meeting. But it really does kind of spark what I think of as a kind of Sputnik moment in global women's rights. Like suddenly the West is put on notice that the East and the South are really going to move on this issue of women's rights, and that the way that they're going to move on it is not by narrowly focusing on equality in the home and in the law, but really on attacking what they see as the global economic system. And it's very much a global economic system. Many of these women at the time were advocating for something called the New International Economic Order, which would redistribute wealth, the wealth that they perceived had been taken from the South and gone to the North, back down to the South. So it was a very, very important moment in history. And in some ways, some of the most lasting international documents, treaties that we have today on women's rights, like CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is signed at the Second World Congress in Copenhagen in 1980 and has been ratified by most of the countries in the world. I think there are only 5 or 6 left that haven't ratified it, including Iran, Somalia, and you guessed it, the United States of America.
These international conferences which punctuate this decade, they're really a very interesting arena, aren't they, for demonstrating the different conceptions of what it means to fight for women's rights, how holistically you see that, how as you were suggesting earlier, how implicated that struggle is within much, much bigger questions. So it's interesting that you say that positive things came out of it, that it was possible to go beyond a sort of loggerheads ideological clash between East and West. That I find an interesting development, given, as you were saying earlier, they were in the depths of the Cold War at the time.
Yeah, so, in Copenhagen in 1980, the Americans actually vote against the conference document. So there are many, many tensions. And there was a threat by Maureen Reagan, who was at the time Ronald Reagan's daughter, who led the 1985 American delegation to Nairobi. The Americans threatened to walk out unless they got their way. And there were some changes that were made to the protocol and the procedures of the conference that would protect the Americans from being too isolated. But look, I think even there were many Americans, by the way, who went to Nairobi. There was always a parallel NGO forum. So there were the official meetings, and then there would be a parallel forum, and many women's activists would go alongside the official delegations. And especially since it was 1985, it was Kenya, women in Africa wanted to talk about apartheid in South Africa. They were really angry about apartheid. They said, what use is the equality between men and women in a society where you have a structural division between blacks and whites? And, and the Americans said, that's not a women's issue. We're here to talk about women's issues. Many of these Western countries didn't want to deal with issues like apartheid. And I think what was so interesting about these meetings and the reason they were so productive is because women from all over the world stood up and said, we don't only want to talk narrowly about women's issues. We want to talk about the world that affects us, the world that we live in. And we do not want to live in apartheid countries anymore. We don't want racism. We don't want this high level of economic inequality that we see. We actually think that we can build a better world together with men so that everybody is better off, not just women. And I think that sometimes flew in the face of a very narrow Western conception of women's rights where men were the enemy, right? There's a kind of fundamental misandry sometimes in some of these feminist texts from this era, which is that it's patriarchy and patriarchy alone that has, sort of forced women into these subservient, inferior positions in society. And women from the global South in particular really felt uncomfortable with that narrative. They really felt that was yet another strategy to divide and conquer the populations of these newly independent or emerging from, years of colonialism, these countries in the global South that were suddenly on the global stage, and then, finding their voice, finding their power in the United Nations, and then a bunch of Western feminists show up and say, oh, you know those men that you fought for independence with, you know those men that you stood and you actually battled with in the fields, they're not your friends. They're patriarchs trying to oppress you. You know, these Zambian women didn't want to hear anything about that. So I do think that it forced Western women also to reconsider their own positions vis-a-vis the aims and goals and tactics necessary to further women's rights, and that was extremely productive.
So you do see signs of that as that decade went on, as that contact increased. It wasn't simply a sort of dialogue where neither side was listening to the other. You see the Western women kind of begin to expand the terms of reference for how they see what they're engaged in?
Well, it's really important to emphasize that there were always women in the West who were on the left side of the feminist issue. So people like Angela Davis, for instance, there were many socialist and communist women that saw that the problem that women faced was not only a problem with patriarchy, but was also a problem of the economic system. However, their voices had been drowned out by what we think of as the sort of more liberal strand of feminism, which, by the way, is not surprisingly much more compatible with a kind of free market for labor and things like that. And so what does start to happen as the decade drags on, continues, and of course, this is also, very time-bound because we know that the Berlin Wall falls in 1989, only 4 years later, and then this dialogue changes incredibly by the Fourth World Conference of Women in Beijing. But what does start to happen is there is a kind of eye-opening among many women in the West who see themselves as, first of all, feminists, liberal feminists. They become very sensitive to the issues of women of color in their own countries. They become very sensitive to issues of what were then called third world women. So, women from the global South whose issues about not being able to go to Harvard, right? Or not being able to become a lawyer or break the glass ceiling and become president, like that, they're dealing with a much more fundamental kind of issue about like, how do you actually put food on the table? What happens in single-headed households by, households headed by women? So there does become increasingly a sensitivity. And I do think that that was a really productive moment for women's rights because it broadened the coalition. And within the decade, if you read the history of the decade, you can see that there's an attempt on both sides to overcome these ideological barriers, particularly around the issue of peace and nuclear disarmament. And after 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union, suddenly you see the ascendance of this feminist narrative from the West, which is women's rights are a product of Western liberal democracy and have nothing to do with the struggles of women in the state socialist East or the global South. And I find that really problematic.
That was really what I was going to go on to ask you about. By the time of the third conference, the fall of the Berlin Wall is only a few years away. We've had these sort of two models vying with each other in the previous years. And I guess what happens then is the sort of Western model floods into Eastern Europe. And I wondered, did the women in Eastern Europe manage to retain some of the things that they had achieved, that they had gained in the preceding decades, or were they sort of overwhelmed by this sort of neoliberal model of capitalism sort of coming in, and were gains actually lost?
Yeah, I think especially in the 90s, there were a lot of losses. In the first instance, obviously, today, Poland has one of the most restrictive abortion laws in Europe, and it happens immediately after the fall of communism in that country, so that women had reproductive freedoms under authoritarian regime, and under democracy, they lose them. How ironic is that, right? You also have in what was then called Eastern Germany, before it reunified with Germany, the largest peacetime birth decline ever recorded in history. Women just sort of stopped having babies for a couple of years. There was such an exogenous shock because so many women were forced out of the labor force. Kindergartens and creches were closed. The economy was absolute upheaval. By 1991, I think there was 40% unemployment in Eastern Germany. And in many of these countries, you have renewed discrimination against women, attacks on the length and benefits associated with things like maternity leave. They no longer become job protected, or, especially the closing of kindergartens and creches makes it very difficult for women to combine their work and family responsibilities. However, it's not all bleak. And I think that there are really positive legacies of the state socialist period because, as you pointed out earlier in the conversation, women's access to education and formal labor force participation starts much earlier in the Eastern Bloc countries than it does in the West. And there's a real attempt to get women into fields like math and science and engineering. And so when we look across the EU today, we see that the countries with the highest percentages of women working in the technology sector, or the countries with the highest percentages of women in science, not surprisingly, are former state socialist countries in the East. There was also a really fascinating 2018 study called Girls, Socialism, and Math, which using a standardized test that compares the math abilities of boys and girls in the same, grade. It's a standardized test done across the EU. You can see that girls growing up in former socialist countries, that the gender gap in math is much smaller than girls who grew up in countries that were on the Western side of the Iron Curtain. So there are these really important legacies in terms of women's rights that we can still see today. And so that's why I emphasize in the article and in all of my work that, as I said, we should not have thrown the baby out with the bathwater. There were some really good things that were done in terms of women's rights, and there were some really profound insights that these movements had. I mean, look, we've just gone through this horrendous pandemic, and I know in the United States and in the United Kingdom, as in many countries around the world, as well as France, that it's women who did the majority of the homeschooling and the childcare and the social care when all the institutions of society closed, right? Because of the pandemic. What we see is that the nuclear family and women's unpaid labor is kind of capitalism's backup plan. When things go wrong, when there's a war and the men go off to fight, you move the women into the labor force. When the men come home, you move them back into the kitchen, right? When there's a pandemic and you've got, we're speaking specifically here about heterosexual couples with children, and somebody needs to do work in the home, who does it? Largely, it's the women, right? So the insights of some of these socialist feminists or, socialist women's activists, as they would probably prefer to be called, are really relevant in 2020, 2021, still to this day, because we're still fighting sort of the same problems that in many ways people like Alexandra Kollontai pointed out and highlighted in the late 19th and early 20th century.
I was speaking to Kristen Ghodsee, who has an article entitled When the Women's Movement Went Global in the July 2021 edition of Le Monde diplomatique. Kristen's also the author of Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism and Other Arguments for Economic Independence, which appeared in 2018 and will soon be available in 14 languages. You can read Kristen's piece for Le Monde diplomatique at mondediplo.com. If you're a subscriber, you can also read every edition of the paper going back over 20 years. And if you're not yet a subscriber, there's plenty of content online to entice you to become one. In the words of John Berger, why read LMD? To make sense of what's happening in the world, behind the misinformation. I hope you'll join me again soon for another interview with one of our contributors. Until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye. English class.